Hello, and welcome to another edition of Champion Briefs video topic analysis. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, and I'm joined with Nethmin Liyanage. And today we're going to discuss the March-April topic, Resolved: In a democracy, a free press ought to prioritize objectivity over advocacy. This topic brings up a lot of timely questions about our current state of media in the United States and also around the world. It's important to note that the topic is a global topic and not a topic that specifies to any one country. It only specifies to groups of countries that would identify themselves in some way as a democracy. Going further on these things, Nethmin, do you have any specifics on topicality that you'd like to address on this topic?
Yes, always. So I think that when starting your research for a topic, it's always important to begin with a question of what is and isn't topical, and what you want to frame in your personal interpretation as what is and isn't topical. So there are a few key words in this resolution that it's important for debaters to define when thinking about topicality. So first are the words objectivity and advocacy. So first, I would recommend that teams to define these words in relation to each other, especially as they have been in conflict in the past. So I would recommend that when defining these two words, teams look to literature regarding the ways in which these two words have been in conflict, or ways in which those two things have had to trade off with each other in the context of free press and a democracy. Similarly, I would recommend finding rigorous definitions for both the press and democracy. I remember when we have had past topics that hinge around either press or democracy, there have been some tricky definitions or interpretations of what democracy and press are. So for press, especially in the age of social media and places like BuzzFeed News having a tab where anyone can become a contributor with just your own laptop, there is a lot of gray area on who is considered press or a journalist or part of the media. So that's something that you're going to want to prioritize in your research. Is someone posting on their Instagram that's public considered a form of press, and thus are they beholden to the same burdens as, say, someone who writes for the New York Times? I don't know, but your affirmative or negative position should definitely answer that question in some form, or at least be prepared to answer it. And similarly, the definition of democracy. So what debaters have found time and time again is that the democracies where there are the most interesting scenarios or perhaps conflicts that could be tipped in one direction or the other using topic literature are democracies that are not full democracies, sometimes called illiberal democracies, developing democracies, partial democracies. These are generally governments or states that are not quite at like the authoritarian regime, North Korea dictator type situation, but are also definitely not at the free and fair elections 100% of the time, no intervention side of life. So often these countries, illiberal democracies, are often, when scholars think of liberal democracies, they often reference Eastern Europe, the former Soviet bloc, that area of the world. So when thinking about definitions for democracy, you should consider how you can perhaps utilize illiberal democracies and press freedoms or lack of press freedoms in those countries to perhaps find a scenario that could be helpful for you. And do you want to talk about past topics that have had some similarity to this and maybe contextualize these definitions?
Yeah, so I think in the past, some of the most important topics that we've dealt with on this issue was like the reporter's privilege topic, and that allowed reporters kind of, I guess if I remember correctly, it was the privilege to report and how they wanted to report, and like a freedom to hide sources and all sorts of things like that. This topic, though, is kind of unique in that it doesn't necessarily look at how the press reports on an issue outside of whether or not the press retains objectivity over the issue. So a lot of people are probably going to try to remember back to the politician's right to be forgotten topic and think that this has a lot of similarities to it. But the difference with this is that it doesn't actually deal with the right to delete articles or anything like that, but rather the topic deals with the government forcing media organizations to either remain objective in their initial reporting or to provide objectivity in reporting by having an alternative viewpoint to the reporting that is present from the network. So there are some little nuances to how the topic will work, but a lot of the issues are going to be the same. You're probably going to hear elections arguments. You're going to hear arguments about misinformation, libel, slander, those types of argumentation. It's just about the method and function of what the affirmative is going to try to be doing, where in this case, the affirmative is just going to be forcing objectivity on media organizations instead of saying media organizations should delete stories or, media organizations should disclose, sources, things like that. I guess that leads us kind of going into kind of some of the arguments on this topic and what can be discussed. And I think a good place to start with that is historically, how has objectivity been placed on the press? In the United States, we had a law that functioned as called the Fairness Doctrine. And there have been advocates in recent years for a new Fairness Doctrine, or a Fairness Doctrine 2.0. These arguments are based on a historical trend that said that media organizations were scarce, right? They existed in a small bubble, and they had a responsibility to the citizenry to report news accurately. And so a restriction on speech could be placed on these organizations, specifically broadcast media organizations that use government airwaves. So these were originally radio broadcasters, and then later on television broadcasters like NBC, CBS, ABC, and the Fox Broadcast Network, not Fox News, which is a cable channel. So these laws only applied to the FCC airwaves and broadcasters using those airwaves, and they were forced to provide an alternative viewpoint to the one that the broadcaster was presenting as the main viewpoint. So think of this as saying that if your local news channel broadcasted a story, the story had to have multiple viewpoints to it. It had to show both sides of any story. So if the KKK was marching in your streets and they were doing a story about the KKK marching in the streets, they not only had to do a take that said the KKK shouldn't be marching in the streets, they also needed to show one that said the KKK should be marching in the streets. They had to show every side of an issue. This is a lot of times confused with the equal time doctrine, which basically says politicians on broadcast networks are deserving of equal time. So if CBS on their broadcast channel broadcasts President Biden saying something, they also need to provide equal time for Republicans to give a response to President Biden. And networks generally were abiding by this rule, and they still actually have to abide by this rule. But that's not the same as objectivity that the Fairness Doctrine would put in place. The Fairness Doctrine legally prescribed that you had to have some other point of view. And the problems that came up with the Fairness Doctrine was what they called a chilling effect. It's why originally Congress got rid of the Fairness Doctrine in the late 80s, and ultimately it faded away from FCC rule interpretation in the early 2000s. They got rid of it because, one, they didn't believe scarcity existed anymore. In the era of cable news and the internet, how can you claim that scarcity exists in the media? There are claims to it, i.e. we all exist in media bubbles, and those media bubbles create an artificial form of scarcity. But generally speaking, the media environment's way bigger now. The other reason they got rid of it is they said there was a massive chilling effect on alternative discourse. Originally, this was seen mostly within conservatives, and that conservatives claimed that their viewpoints were kind of cut out of American media. And this is actually true. There is a trend of this. The Johnson and Kennedy administrations in the 1960s used the Fairness Doctrine specifically to silence conservative dissent to their administration and to the Vietnam War. So there is a history of silencing and, First Amendment potential issues with the Fairness Doctrine. But there are advocates for the Fairness Doctrine in the 21st century that proclaim they have solvency for many of the different issues that came out with the Fairness Doctrine. Obviously, the old issues of constitutionality are going to arise, and also an effectiveness. There's something that we haven't touched on, which is called a hostile media perception. And that's that If you are liberal, you are going to be hostile to conservative news organizations. And if you are conservative, you are going to be hostile towards liberal news organizations. And there's a question over whether or not those organizations would, one, provide true objectivity, right? Would Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity really provide the best counter to their arguments, or would they set up straw men to kind of knock down easily and appease the viewers that they have of the liberal or conservative opinion winning? In many cases, this is what they're already doing, and it would just be kind of codified legally. And there's a question over whether that really overcomes how hostile we are to news sources from other sides. And with that, I think we kind of get into this issue of fake news, right? And calling each thing fake news. And Nethmin, how does the topic really address fake news?
Yeah, for sure. So I think the fake news is going to be core ground on the affirmative for this topic, especially in light of recent events that we can think about, such as government officials telling people to go and drink bleach about their coronavirus diagnosis. I think that we can all agree that there's been a little bit too much misinformation and disinformation going around. So fake news has potential to be a really good core argument on this topic, and one of, in my opinion, the best reasons to actively advocate for pure objectivity in journalism over any form of advocacy. So there's been a huge spread of fake news recently, as we know, sometimes called alternative facts, and this could be a reason to prioritize objectivity over advocacy. There are a few different advantage areas that teams could read. First, there's just like the pure ethical standpoint of we probably shouldn't be telling people to drink bleach in general, period. Or the more utilitarian standpoint or perspective of stopping public health disasters, stopping disinformation, maybe other scenarios that could come from that, such as hospitals being overwhelmed or new variants. And the disinformation is broadly applicable to also things like masking, misinformation or disinformation on mask mandates or other policies that are meant to keep us safe from coronavirus, misinformation on certain treatments that were given to people about for coronavirus that maybe necessarily weren't the best, but that pharmaceutical companies were stakeholders in. I think that all of these things, especially in the context of COVID, could be reasons or really good timely scenarios for objectivity over advocacy. And for debaters who like policy style debate and want an extinction scenario, I think that this could provide a really interesting way to get to an extinction scenario, since a lot of people have past. But outside of COVID, there's also in general there's been a pretty large rise in fake news or misinformation over the past 4 or 5 years. And objectivity over advocacy could kind of prioritize, forcing media outlets to in some way prioritize news that's been fact checked, independently verified, not verified by the fact checker that's on their own website. And I think that could be something that would be good for media in general, but also could mean that you could read this advantage with like a structural violence affirmative or a more philosophically based affirmative, because there are definitely philosophical interpretations for how the media has a role to provide correct information, since it acts as a check on the government or a check on absolute power. And similarly, there are lots of structural violence-based justifications for why, when you are disenfranchised in society, that means that news outlets or other places that provide the news to you for free are probably going to be your only form of access to information. And that's a reason that structural violence-based affirmatives could be really good on this topic. And then do you want to talk about another implication of fake news?
Yeah, so I was, Kantianism with fake news is, I think, a big thing. And so for Phil apps, if you are a Kant debater and you're looking at, a link into how I can run a, Phil-based affirmative on this topic, I think fake news is probably the best link into it, as just, people have an ethical responsibility not to lie. Disinformation is an active form of lying. And so like for Kant debaters, like that's going to be the big link. You're going to have to negatives are going to have to prove that like you have a right to lie on on this topic, and I think it's going to be a hard argument for negatives maybe to overcome with the Kantian framework. It's not to say that Kantianism is a great argument, and there aren't a lot of problems within Kantianism internally about like universalization and norm setting and everything like that. But for affirmatives who are willing to engage in those debates, this is the big link for you all. The other argument I would say on fake news on like a util-based standard would be kind of the environment, and just kind of how like environmental issues are commonly, put down, minimized and all sorts of stuff. There's disinformation around environmental problems. Who's causing them? Are they actually problems? And so there's probably a good, strong link to an environment argument. And then I guess the elephant in the room is elections. We in America, we had our own electoral issues with January 6th and trusting the media there. But I know on a wider issue, there are some bigger issues with elections. Do you want to talk about like the illiberal democracies, Nethmin?
Yeah, for sure. I can talk about illiberal democracies and ways in which elections can be impacted by the media. So we've seen in illiberal democracies in the past instances of propaganda campaigns that are run in the media by perhaps other nations or nations that formerly had control over smaller nations. And especially in democracies that are still getting their footing, this can be really, really disastrous, especially in the context of election rigging. Obviously, there's no shortage of instances of a powerful country installing a puppet regime in another country and utilizing the media or other forms of swaying public opinion in order to do so. And election rigging could be especially dangerous now in a world where democratization is attempting to be pushed in certain countries that were formerly maybe part of a larger empire. But election rigging or intervention can really derail that progress. And there's a lot of literature out there about how backsliding leads to more war, leads to more economic instability, leads to worse quality of life for citizens, leads to more instability. And we can see that all of these things can be impacted under a variety of different framing mechanisms, no matter what your affirmative is. So election rigging could be a really powerful argument on the affirmative of this topic. And the affirmative could access election rigging not by saying that they fiat away all election rigging, because obviously that would be massively extra topical. However, the affirmative could make arguments about how election rigging is uniquely controlled by the media, or rather, countries that try to rig the elections of other countries use the media in order to do so. And that in those instances, media outlets, news outlets, publications all have an active responsibility to make sure that they are not reporting information that is false or that has been intentionally manipulated, or only provides a very narrow and perhaps opinion-based perspective of a certain issue. And I think that this could be impacted out to a variety of things, whether it's strengthening democracy or avoiding the rise of a certain country or a country or series of countries, or maybe economics, oppression. I think that there are lots of good impact scenarios for this. But what this really necessitates is that debaters learn about a country that's not the United States. I think that often debaters miss out on really good arguments on a lot of different topics, not just this one, simply because they won't Google something about an electoral system in any country that's not the US. So make sure that when you are doing your research for this topic, you're able to take kind of a global or international point of view, but also that you aren't just going into those debates with assumptions about the US and just assuming it all carries over and cross applies and is all the same. So Google some other countries is my fun little wisdom of the day.
Yeah, just coming to mind, like Hungary with Viktor Orban, and currently in the Ukraine, which is a democracy, and what's going on within the Ukraine and Russia. And, there's all sorts of disinformation campaigns about, invasions into the Donbass and, all sorts of stuff happening right now. And so accurate reporting on like Ukraine may be an internal link to or link into some sort of impact scenario with Russia. There are a lot of different countries that claim to be democracies that have varying levels of a free press and what that means. I think one final thing to note on the affirmative is that American style free speech is not the same free speech that exists around the rest of the world and what they consider free speech. Europe considers reasonable limitations on speech to exist with free speech, right? Responsible limitations on speech. There are European countries that limit anti-democratic speech because they say anti-democratic speech is antithetical to democracy. And so that's one form of speech that should not be allowed in the marketplace because it damages the marketplace itself, the marketplace being the marketplace of ideas. So I think that's a pretty good kind of outline of the core affirmative arguments that we're both seeing on this topic. On the negative, to me, just the idea of objectivity existing is pretty tough. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Nethmin?
I totally agree. When I saw this topic, the first thing I thought was that's not how the world works. But such is life. We have topics and then we debate them and then we continue to live. But on this particular topic, I think that an argument that could be particularly powerful for the negative is the subjectivity K. And I just want to highlight that don't turn your ears off now if you're a traditional debater who doesn't intend to read a K, because I think that this argument is more of a philosophical idea or just an abstract idea than it is specifically a criticism that needs to be read in like the link impact alternative roll the ballot format. So the subjectivity K criticizes the way in which the resolution is formatted and the binary choice that the resolution poses, because the resolution isn't super indicative of how journalism works. We all have different lived experiences that we bring with us to journalism and any other thing we do in life. And as such, objectivity isn't actually totally possible to prioritize over advocacy, especially in a world where we don't have perfect data. In a world where we had perfect data about every single issue ever, then pure objectivity would be a lot easier insofar as we have clear research-backed, science-based, objective, anti-racist, anti-sexist studies on every single issue. However, that's not the case, and often journalists are working with a skewed perspective or a study that was funded by a think tank that also sells military grade weapons to civilians, or maybe a study that wasn't necessarily carried out in a way that was entirely ethically or scientifically legitimate. And in those instances, it's very hard for someone, especially like a minoritized journalist, for example, to go and cite this study from Lockheed Martin about why like bombing Black and brown nations is actually super, super good. That might not exactly be objectivity, even if that's what the most relevant or leading studies in the field say, because the information that journalists are working with from a starting point are not pieces of objective information. And as such, they can't convert something that is probably pretty subjective, biased, and in line with certain interests and convert it into something that's magically objective and then just spit it out and call it journalism. So I think that that is the first thing or two things to remember, is that there's no perfectly objective information and that there are always divided interests, and that journalists bring into it their own personal experience and lived experience. And I know a lot of people, journalists or not, who would have a hard time advocating for things that are necessarily antithetical to their identity or like the way in which they experience the world. So this argument can be read as kind of just a reason to presume neg, just vote neg on presumption because the affirmative isn't viable or can't happen anyway. And can also be read as a criticism with like the more identity-based or more soft left-based arguments that I just touched on. But the important thing that this argument gets to is that the core of the resolution or the thesis of the resolution simply is not possible to accomplish. We simply cannot separate objectivity and advocacy and then just kind of be like, oh, I'm going to choose one today, and this is the one we're going to do. So that's what this argument really hits at, and not necessarily the fact that it needs to be a K. So traditional debaters, I definitely recommend looking into and making this argument as well, whether it's a contention on a 1NC or even just reading it as an overview on the 1AC case page, because I think that debaters will get a lot of benefit out of thinking critically about how objectivity and advocacy function and the way in which they can or cannot be separated. So I recommend doing this research even if you don't actually want to read the position on the topic, because I think a lot of times debaters have a tendency to look at the topic and go, oh, there's my advocacy / whatever my AF is, and there's everything else that's neg ground. And then debaters don't really think critically about how those two things interact or how there are potential other interpretations of the topic, which leads to some very interestingly one-sided or shallow debates. So that's my 2 cents on the subjectivity K. Do you have any other thoughts on negative arguments?
Yeah, just couple of brief ones. I mean, outside of the obvious defenses of just like pure free speech, government regulation of speech bad, I think there are a couple of different arguments that can address affirmative offense, especially when it comes to like US based things. And the first is that it's a local media ownership counterplan. Right now in the United States, there are like these local media monopolies or very, very close to monopolies that are defined out by like regulations to allow them to not be monopolies, but still functionally monopolize a local media market. So like Sinclair Media is the typical one that's pointed out, and that they own in many areas over 50% of the local media options. So that means that when you turn to your local broadcast channels, whether, usually they're like 1 through 10, whatever it is, something like that, or maybe it's up to 32. But like when you turn to your local ABC network, and when you turn to your local CBS, and when you turn to your local Fox, and when you turn to your local NBC, in many media markets, all 4 of those stations are owned by one company, or they're owned by one company and then the subsidiary of that company. So it's functionally separate companies that own them, but they're actually owned by the same parent corporation. And so there's a limitation on the diversity of views in the local media market that exists. And that creates some of the problems that maybe we're seeing with these like media bubbles. And if local media can be more diversified in their ownership and point of views presented in local media, you may have increased solvency for some issues. Generally speaking, I think also, negatives are going to be running some disadvantages on the topic, like the midterms DA, and how maybe a forced objectivity can affect the midterm elections. Anytime you enter into an election year, January 1st of that election year, it's fair game for midterms or an elections DA. So debaters should be prepared on this issue. And then finally, I think debaters should just prepare on this topic on a wide variety of issues, both AF and neg. It's never good to lock into here's my AF advocacy, like Nethmin said, and here's my neg advocacy. Especially on a topic like this, where things are somewhat fluid in Eastern Europe right now, and there are a lot of impacts that are going to be kind of stemming from the media and the media's perception of Ukraine, our current election issues. The January 6th committee is going to continue to meet during this topic, and there's going to be information released potentially involving media bias and how the media affected election interference. So my advice would be to research a lot and keep researching. Nethmin, any last advice?
I think I'll conclude with the same advice I always conclude with, which is please cut good evidence, especially good topicality evidence. It's no use to anyone if you cut a random card that's totally out of context and from like dictionary.com that doesn't take into account the context of the topic. So cut your topicality and definition cards from the topic literature, from articles that are doing comparative analysis on how objectivity and advocacy impact each other in the context of democratic press. And then the last thing, as always, but especially for this topic, is be nice to your judges. Judge diversity is good. And even if you get a judge that you aren't happy with, or you get a lay judge, just remember that that's probably a parent who is giving up their Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Thursdays too, if you live in Texas, so that their kids can have some more academic opportunities. So just try to understand where parent judges are coming from, especially on this topic, as I know that every year I see a lot of anger about someone not qualifying to NCFLs because of a parent judge or something along those lines. So please be kind to judges, even ones that are not ideal. The lack of qualified judging in a judging pool is never that specific parent's fault. It's always the fault of a tournament director or a school who won't pay for more judging or something like that. So please be understanding of parent judges. Please don't be mean to parent judges. Just think about if that was your parent who was judging so that you could have a chance at going to another tournament. You probably wouldn't want people to be mean to them. So cut good evidence and be good people, or at least marginally okay people. At least stay above the 50th percentile. That's my advice. Anything from you?
Yeah, I second that. Just be nice, especially on a topic where you're going to be dealing with people's core political values. You remember hostile media perception. If you're going to be criticizing somebody's preferred, news outlet, you're also criticizing who they are at their core. And so be nice. And yeah, good luck. And for all of us here at Champions Brief, we thank you for watching and wish you luck on this next topic.